Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're venturing into a topic that's both fundamental and, let's face it, often shrouded in a bit of mystery, the science of sex.
Yeah, it definitely is.
We had a listener share Mary Roach's book, Bonk, The Curious Coupling of Science and Sex, with us, and, well, that's our jumping off point for this exploration.
That's right. And when you actually delve into how science has, tried to understand sex, you uncover this really fascinating, sometimes strange history of inquiry.
Exactly. And just to be clear, our aim here isn't to give our personal opinions on, well, any of the research in Bonk.
No, not at all. Think of us more as guides, really. We're here to help you navigate this material, pull out the most, let's say, interesting or thought-provoking bits. A shortcut, maybe?
A shortcut, I like that. Because what immediately grabbed me about Bonk is just the sheer variety of methods scientists have used over the years. I mean, from watching animals to some, pretty unusual, maybe even outlandish tech.
Oh, definitely unconventional. It's been quite a journey, to try and understand this core part of being human. Researchers haven't always shied away from the strange stuff.
Right.
So we'll be looking at some people who really pushed boundaries, the sometimes secretive ways they worked, and yeah, some pretty surprising anatomical observations too. Get ready for some unexpected insights, I think.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with some of the early figures. Mary Roach brings up John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism.
Right, Watson. So behaviorism, for anyone not familiar, it's all about observable behavior, not inner thoughts or feelings.
Pavlov's dogs, little Albert, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And Watson, he argued pretty strongly, actually, for bringing the study of human sexuality right into the lab, just like any other scientific subject.
He thought it was illogical for science to just ignore something so, well, vital.
Precisely. He was critical of relying on anecdotes or religious views or Freudian ideas. He wanted careful study by scientifically trained students of sex, as he put it, in controlled settings. His specific vision of a dedicated lab didn't quite happen in his time, but that push for a scientific approach, it definitely paved the way.
I can only imagine how radical that must have sounded back then. I mean, conditioning a baby was already controversial.
Oh, yeah.
But studying adult sexuality in a lab, that must have really rattled some cages.
Undoubtedly. The social climate, it made openly studying sex really difficult. Watson's proposal, while maybe not immediately picked up everywhere, was a big shift in thinking.
So who did pick it up, maybe in a less public way?
Yeah.
Alfred Kinsey comes to mind from the book.
Ah, Kinsey. Yes, he took a very different route, much more clandestine. Roach describes him doing early research literally in the attic of his own house.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Filming his staff's sexual activities?
Yep. Heterosexual, homosexual, masturbation, all under the sort of official cover of mammalian behavior studies.
That's incredible. Doing that kind of research in your own home, it shows how driven they must have been, right? Despite the risks.
It was incredibly secretive. He even hired a commercial photographer, paid him out of the Institute's mammalian behavior studies budget.
Wow.
And because it was so secret, the main subjects ended up being his own colleagues and their partners, which really highlights the challenges, the risks they felt were involved back then.
And it sounds like not everyone on the team was entirely comfortable. Roach mentions Clyde Martin refusing to be filmed with his wife.
That's right.
While Wardell Pomeroy was apparently all about the scientific purity, claiming he felt nothing watching. That's quite a range.
It really underscores how personal and sensitive this was, even for the researchers themselves. Pomeroy's focus on objectivity, that reflects the whole effort to make sex research seem legitimate, scientific, not just voyeuristic.
But okay, ethical questions aside for a moment, but
Yeah.
Kinsey did make some pretty surprising biological observations during these sessions, didn't he?
He did. Very detailed ones.
Things like earlobe swelling, increased nasal mucus, even saliva being potentially spurted. I mean, who knew?
It shows Kinsey's focus on the biology. A casual observer sees the obvious signs, but Kinsey, the trained scientist, he's documenting these less obvious physiological reactions.
Right.
This detailed, almost clinical approach, even if the methods seem questionable today, it was a big step towards seeing sex as a biological function you could actually study, moving away from just morals or stories.
Still, it's hard not to feel that cringe factor Roach talks about looking back at this early stuff. The ethics.
Oh, absolutely. Early sex research often didn't have the kind of robust ethical frameworks we expect now. Looking back, you definitely see issues with privacy, consent.
Yeah.
But it's also important, I think, to understand the historical context. The prevailing attitudes towards studying sex were just very, very different.
Okay, so moving forward in time a bit, Bonk brings us to William Masters and Virginia Johnson.
Yeah.
The research sounds much more direct and definitely more high-tech for the time.
Indeed. They brought sex research properly into the lab, and they used innovative tech, the penis camera, for instance.
The penis camera, right. What exactly was that for?
Well, it was basically a clear, phallus-shaped device with a camera inside. It was inserted into the vagina to film internal responses during artificial coition.
Wow. So they could see what was happening inside.
Exactly. It let them directly observe things like vaginal lubrication. They figured out it was plasma seepage, not from glands, which was the old idea.
And this kind of direct observation, it led them to challenge some big ideas, didn't it? Like the whole concept of a separate vaginal orgasm.
Yes, famously. Their research strongly suggested that physiologically all orgasms were basically the same and rooted in clitoral stimulation, regardless of how they were triggered.
Which really flew in the face of the sort of vaginocentric view, right? The idea that penetration was the key thing for women.
Exactly. That view really prioritized vaginal penetration. Masters and Johnson's work suggested the clitoris was central, physiologically speaking.
But wait, if their artificial penis camera thingy didn't directly stimulate the clitoris, like, say, manual stimulation would, how did they explain the orgasms their subjects did have?
Ah, good question. They came up with a theory they called labial traction.
Labial traction.
Yeah, the idea was that the in and out motion of the artificial phallus pulled on the labia minora, the inner lips, and that indirectly stimulated the clitoris. But that theory wasn't universally accepted.
Right, which maybe brings us to Alzate and Londoño. They took a different approach, using manual stimulation.
They did. They explored vaginal erotic sensitivity much more directly using finger pressure. They worked with both paid sex workers and unpaid feminists, interestingly.
And what did they find? Did they find these sweet spots people talk about?
They identified erogenous zones, yeah, particularly on the front wall of the vagina. That could lead to orgasm in many subjects, especially the sex workers. But crucially, they found that simulating intercourse movements was less effective than direct pressure on these spots.
Huh. So that casts some doubt on the whole labial traction idea being the only way.
It certainly complicates it, and the different responses between the sex workers and the feminists also raise interesting questions about, experience, sensitivity, maybe even expectations.
Okay, so from the clinical lab, Bonk takes this kind of detour into the world of sex machines.
Ah, yes, the machines.
There's apparently a whole subculture. Timothy Archibald even wrote a book about it. What's the appeal, according to the source? It seems like a really wide range of reasons.
Archibald's work shows it's really diverse. For some, yeah, it's the physical sensation, the steady rhythm a machine can provide. Predictability?
Control, maybe?
Control, novelty, yeah. For others, it's almost like eroticizing the machine itself. Some saw it as a safe way to explore, maybe avoiding relationship complexities, even described by some as pouring for homophobes or a safe third party.
Wow, that's quite a spectrum. It makes you think about desire for control, predictability, or just new experiences.
Absolutely. It taps into a lot of different facets of sexuality.
Roach also mentions William Harvey's patent, a therapeutic apparatus for relieving sexual frustrations in women without sex partners. But he seemed to think the feeling of connection was important.
That's a key difference. Harvey's view emphasized the emotional side. Even without a partner, his device aimed for physical release and a sense of connection that he felt other, maybe more purely mechanical devices missed.
And then there's that anecdote, the woman in the satin nightgown trying out the thrill hammer at an event. It sounds almost like performance art.
It does paint a picture, doesn't it? It highlights the curiosity, the experimental side, maybe even a bit of the theatrical nature of that scene.
Okay, let's circle back to anatomy. This part of Bonk introduces Princess Marie Bonaparte and her theory of the teleclitoridienne. This one's memorable.
Ah, Bonaparte, yes. Her idea was about the distance between the vagina and the clitoris.
Right, she thought if that distance was too long, over 2.5 centimeters, like an inch, women couldn't orgasm during intercourse. Judging potential by ruler seems a bit simplistic.
It does sound reductive now, yeah. But she actually collected a fair amount of data trying to prove it. She measured quite a few women.
And the surprising thing is, when Kim Wallen reanalyzed her data much later, using better statistical methods, he found she might have actually been onto something.
Sort of, yes. Wallen's reanalysis did find a correlation supporting her basic finding. It suggested that clitoral proximity might indeed play a role for some women in achieving orgasm during intercourse. The rule of thumb, literally.
That's wild. So it's not the whole story, obviously, but maybe a piece.
Possibly one factor among many, it definitely leads into later research exploring other potential areas.
Like Beverly Whipple's work on the G-spot.
Exactly. Whipple brought the G-spot into mainstream awareness, suggesting another potential orgasm-inducing zone inside the vagina.
And wasn't there also research by someone named Levin on the urethra?
Roy Levin, yes. He explored the erotic sensitivity of the female urethra and the tissue around it, the female glands, or periurethral glands. He suggested its stimulation during intercourse might contribute to orgasm for some women, too.
So the anatomical landscape seems way more complex than just the clitoris alone.
Absolutely. It's a much richer picture than earlier theories allowed.
And poor Princess Bonaparte. She was so convinced by her distance theory, she actually had surgery to move her clitoris closer, the Halban-Narjani operation.
She did. A drastic step.
And it didn't even work for her in the end.
No, unfortunately not. It really underscores the personal drive behind some of this research, but also the limits of purely anatomical fixes for something as complex as sexual response.
It's fascinating how the whole focus on how women orgasm has shifted over time. Roach points out that some older marriage manuals actually told husbands to stimulate the clitoris.
That's a really important point. It wasn't always this purely vaginocentric view. There were times when clitoral stimulation was recognized, even recommended, in marital advice.
But then Kinsey's research came along and really hammered home that only a minority of women consistently orgasm from intercourse alone without extra clitoral stimulation.
Exactly. Kinsey's data was pretty compelling. It showed the importance of the clitoris for the majority of women's orgasmic experience. You'd think that would settle it.
But apparently not. Roach describes this backlash, this resurgence of the vaginal orgasm, as the ideal, even influencing doctors to kind of ignore clitoral foreplay.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Despite the scientific evidence, cultural norms, maybe a discomfort with challenging traditional ideas about sex, led to resistance. The vaginal orgasm somehow became this benchmark of normal femininity for some, even shaping medical advice against the evidence.
Society just wasn't ready, maybe. Okay, let's switch gears to the Upsuck Chronicles. That's quite a name. Dealing with sperm and conception.
Yes, that section looks at historical ideas and research around conception.
Including the old belief in womanly seed, and that simultaneous orgasm was crucial for getting pregnant. Sounds almost poetic.
For centuries, yeah, the idea was that both partners contributed something essential, and mutual pleasure, especially simultaneous orgasm, helped those contributions combine effectively.
But then science comes along to spoil the romance again. Lazzaro Spallanzani's experiment with artificial insemination in a dog suggested pleasure wasn't needed.
Spallanzani's work, while maybe a bit crude by today's standards, did demonstrate fertilization could happen without mating, or presumably female pleasure. A big step in understanding the mechanics.
And then there's the chemistry prostaglandins in semen causing uterine contractions. That adds another layer, suggesting the body has mechanisms beyond just orgasm helping sperm along.
Right. Prostaglandins are hormone-like substances in semen that can trigger uterine contractions, potentially assisting sperm transport. It shows biological factors are at play, separate from the subjective experience of orgasm.
Roach also mentions an experiment with rabbits' manual stimulation led to dye moving into the uterus. That implies the female body is playing an active role, even without sperm involved.
That rabbit study is intriguing, yes. It suggests female physiological responses, maybe even suborgasmic ones, could help move fluids and potentially sperm up the reproductive tract, hinting at a more active role than just being a passive recipient.
And what about animal orgasm itself? Roach mentions observations in chimps and macaques. Do animals experience something similar to us?
It's tricky to study definitively, obviously, but there's evidence suggesting female primates, at least, show physiological responses very much like human orgasm. It raises fascinating questions about the evolutionary purpose of female pleasure.
Yet, Roach notes infertility doctors seem hesitant to actually focus on orgasm as a conception strategy. Given all this, why not explore it?
It's likely due to the sensitivity around infertility. Focusing on orgasm might inadvertently make couples feel blamed, like they're doing it wrong, adding emotional burden when they're already struggling. It's a delicate area.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, next up. Trying to actually see inside during sex, coital imaging Sounds both fascinating and incredibly awkward.
It is both, yes. The challenges are huge, finding volunteers willing to have sex in an MRI machine or while being probed with ultrasound.
Right, and the cost, the technical limits.
Exactly, it's not easy.
Roach mentions Marie Carmichael Stopes claiming coital interlocking based on her own self-observations. That's dedication, I suppose.
Stopes was certainly dedicated, but her claims about the penis and cervix locking together, made without formal medical training and based on subjective experience, were met with skepticism and later largely debunked by imaging.
And the actual MRI studies sound like a nightmare. Holding your breath, guys losing erections, not exactly natural conditions.
Precisely. The MRI environment is so artificial. The need for stillness, the noise, the confinement, it inevitably affects the natural flow and physiological response.
Which Roach herself experienced with the ultrasound experiment with her husband, right? It sounds so clinical, so detached. Jeff, shall we do something? While covered in gel.
Her personal account really highlights that disconnect. The focus is all on the mechanics, the image on the screen, rather than the intimacy or the feeling. It becomes a technical exercise.
The book also throws in the theory of the human penis as a semen displacement device, and the idea that the last bit of ejaculate might be spermicidal. Biology sounds pretty ruthless sometimes.
That theory frames penile shape and ejaculate composition in terms of sperm competition, essentially, removing rival sperm and potentially hindering subsequent swimmers. It's a stark evolutionary perspective.
And we can't forget Robert Latu Dickinson's collection of vaginal casts as historical documents of anatomical variation.
Dickinson's casts, yes, a unique, if somewhat unusual, historical record reflecting the interest in documenting the range of human anatomy, even the most intimate parts.
Okay, switching gears again. Impotence, or what we now usually call erectile dysfunction, ED. Bonk introduces Dr. Jianglong Su in Taiwan. His surgical treatment, vein ligation, apparently had really high success rates.
Yes, his reported rates for that specific surgery were notably high compared to elsewhere.
And Roach mentions a slightly unusual potential explanation. The politeness of Taiwanese patients? Maybe not wanting to tell the doctor it didn't work?
That's mentioned as a speculative factor, yeah. It highlights how difficult it can be to interpret patient-reported outcomes and how cultural norms might subtly influence things. It's hard to know for sure.
The book also tracks the shift in thinking about ED, right?
Yeah.
From mostly psychological causes to more physiological ones, especially with the arrival of Viagra.
Absolutely. The introduction of PDE5 inhibitors, like Viagra drugs that work by increasing blood flow, was a massive shift. It really moved ED treatment firmly into the physiological realm in medicine.
But it's not always purely physical, is it? Roach points out Viagra can act like a bridge for anxiety-related ED, often used alongside therapy.
Exactly. Performance anxiety is a huge factor for many men. A drug like Viagra can help restore physical function, which then builds confidence and breaks that anxiety cycle. So the mind-body connection is crucial. It's often best used with psychological support.
It's almost funny, in a dark way, to read about the historical beliefs. Yeah. Impotence caused by masturbation, and those devices to stop nocturnal emissions. Penile pricking rings. Oh, shh.
Yeah, the historical association of masturbation with all sorts of ailments, including impotence, led to some really bizarre and unpleasant cures or prevention methods, reflects a deep misunderstanding of basic sexual function.
And the legal side. Impotence being grounds for divorce historically led to these absurd situations described in the book, bizarre physical exams in court.
Oh, yes. Public and often humiliating.
The Marquis de Gevreux hiring a theater troupe to try and arouse him for the judges. And Michel trying to manipulate his own penis during the exam. Hidden splints. You couldn't make this up.
It reads like farce sometimes, doesn't it? But it shows how high the stakes were, socially and legally, surrounding male potency. The lengths men went to. It underscores the pressure.
And just as an aside, Roach notes crooked penises are apparently pretty common. Dr. Su's analogies comparing them to communists or bowing Japanese gentlemen add a bit of levity.
Dr. Su's way of describing it definitely helps normalize what's a common anatomical variation. A bit of humor can diffuse sensitivity.
Then there's the whole quest for virility. Some truly wild stuff here, like Serge Voronov grafting ape testicles onto men for rejuvenation. Sounds like mad science.
Voronov's experiments were based on the hormonal understanding of the time, but yeah, they seem extreme now. Transplanting animal glands? It captured the public imagination, but was largely unsuccessful in humans, despite some claims of success in aged rams.
And Leo Stanley doing similar things with human and animal testicles on prisoners at San Quentin definitely raises serious ethical flags looking back.
It certainly reflects a time with very different ethical standards for research, especially involving vulnerable populations like prisoners.
The book also mentions dried animal penises in traditional Chinese medicine, though Roach clarifies the popular idea about tiger penis isn't actually in the traditional texts.
Right. While various animal products were used historically based on beliefs about potency, the tiger penis specifically isn't listed in the core Chinese materia medica texts. It seems to be more of a folk belief or later addition.
And the modern twist, trying Viagra on pandas who are struggling to breed.
That anecdote shows modern science tackling reproductive challenges, sometimes in unexpected ways, even across species.
Roach also covers more conventional modern ED treatments injections, urethral suppositories like MUSC, but then highlights Arnold Kegel.
Ah, cable exercises.
Yes, he discovered those pelvic floor exercises primarily for incontinence, but they turned out to potentially benefit sexual function too, right? For both men and women.
That's correct. Strengthening the pelvic floor muscles can improve urinary control, but there's also evidence it can enhance sexual sensation and function. A simple, non-invasive approach with wide benefits.
Okay, now for maybe one of the trickiest areas, the female arousal puzzle. And it really does sound like a puzzle. Roach talks about this disconnect for women between physical responses, like lubrication, and actually feeling aroused.
Precisely. It's a key difference. For men, an erection usually correlates pretty well with subjective arousal. For women, the body can show signs lubrication, blood flow increasing, but the woman herself might not feel turned on mentally or emotionally. It's much less straightforward.
Which makes things like the vaginal photoplethysmograph, that device measuring blood flow, kind of limited for diagnosing arousal disorder, right? The body might be responding, but the mind isn't necessarily there.
Exactly. The photoplethysmograph gives objective physiological data, but it often doesn't match up well with women's self-reported arousal levels. You need to look at both the physical and the psychological aspects.
Cindy Meston's lab developed the arousometer. That sounds interesting, allowing continuous self-reporting. What did that show?
Mason's research using that tool suggested that some women with arousal disorders might not even be aware that their bodies are physically responding. They might have lubrication, engorgement, but not consciously register it.
Ah, which could explain why drugs like Viagra, which target blood flow, don't work for all women with arousal issues.
Potentially, yes. If the issue isn't purely blood flow, but maybe attention or processing those physical signals, then Viagra might not address the core problem for everyone.
And the book mentions off-label uses of things like Ritalin to improve focus. And anecdotal reports about marijuana seems people are looking beyond just blood flow.
It suggests arousal involves more than just hydraulics, Attention, mental state, perception, these might play roles. But it's crucial to note these are often off-label or anecdotal, lacking rigorous, large-scale scientific backing for sexual use specifically.
Meredith Chivers' research also sounds really significant, finding women's genitals can respond physically to a much wider range of stimuli than men's, even non-human stuff.
Yes, Chivers' work is fascinating. It suggests female genital arousal is less stimulus-specific. Physical responses can occur even to stimuli the woman doesn't find subjectively arousing or even find subversive, like depictions of non-consensual sex or non-human sex.
Which doesn't mean desire, just
Nope.
physical reaction.
Exactly. It points towards a more reflexive physiological response, separate from conscious desire or preference.
And that connects to the really difficult concept of reflex arousal, like in cases of rage or spinal cord injury, where the body responds physically without any subjective arousal at all.
That's a critical distinction. Reflex arousal demonstrates starkly that physiological genital responses, lubrication, erection can happen due to direct physical stimulation, or even physiological shifts like fear-induced blood flow changes, entirely without psychological desire or pleasure. It's purely mechanical.
And speaking of misinterpreting physical responses, the Canadian government's fruit machine, trying to detect homosexuals based on pupil dilation or sweat, a real cautionary tale.
A very stark one. It highlights the immense danger of trying to determine someone's complex identity or orientation based on simple, often unreliable bodily measurements. Sexuality is far too nuanced for that.
Then there's Dr. Ahmed Shafiq in Egypt, researching sexual reflexes like the vaginocavernosus reflex or the adductor reflex leg squeezing, more involuntary actions.
Yes, Shafiq's work focused on these automatic muscle responses to sexual stimuli, like how certain muscles contract during arousal or orgasm without conscious effort. It emphasizes the body's intricate, reflexive involvement.
Roach's description of the difficulty Shafik faced doing sex research in Egypt really highlights the cultural hurdles, doesn't it? Religious restrictions, sensitivity around even using the word sex.
Absolutely. It underscores how deeply cultural and religious norms can impact scientific inquiry in this field. Getting ethical approval, finding volunteers, even basic anatomical studies like using cadavers can be extremely challenging in some contexts.
And that anecdote where a volunteer refused vaginal reflex testing, so they demonstrated the cremastek reflex, the testicle rising on a man instead. It's kind of funny, but also shows the awkward hoops researchers sometimes jump through.
It does illustrate the resourcefulness needed, and again, the specific sensitivities around female sexuality in certain cultures that researchers have to navigate.
The insights from the Egyptian journalist Roach spoke to also paint a picture of potential misinformation and lack of open discussion about sex there.
Yeah, it suggests potential gaps in comprehensive sex education and accurate information, which isn't unique to Egypt, of course, but highlights challenges faced when open discussion is limited.
Okay, let's talk hormones. Bonk discusses their big influence, especially on female desire across the menstrual cycle. Libido peaking around ovulation feels like biology pulling strings.
Hormones like estrogen and testosterone definitely modulate female libido. Those cyclical peaks around ovulation are pretty well documented. It makes evolutionary sense, aligning desire with the fertile window.
And the book suggests these hormones might even drive seemingly irrational behavior, like one-night stands or affairs linked to that biological imperative. Kind of unsettling, the idea we're just puppets.
Well, puppets might be too strong. Hormones exert a powerful influence, creating predispositions or urges, absolutely. But human behavior is incredibly complex. Cognition, social factors, personal history, conscious choice, all play huge roles too. Hormones don't dictate everything.
The monkey examples from Yerke's Primate Center really struck it down, though, don't they? Females actively soliciting males when they're fertile. It's very direct.
Primate studies offer a clearer window into those basic biological drives, yeah. Less overlaid with the complex social rules and cognitive layers we humans have, you see the hormonal influence more sparkly.
And those studies showing cheating women's activity with lovers often lines up with their fertile phase, while sex with husbands is more random. That seems like a direct link, even if it's uncomfortable data.
Those findings do suggest a potential hormonal undercurrent influencing mate selection or extra-pair mating strategies, aligning behavior with peak fertility, at least statistically, in those studies.
Roach also describes how subtly female rhesus monkeys solicit sex like a quick hand slide, a tail movement. Makes you wonder about our own subtle cues.
It highlights how nuanced sexual communication can be, even non-verbally, across species. We probably have our own versions we're not always conscious of.
Then there's the speed of reproduction. Sneaky copulation in animals as a strategy. And chimpanzees ejaculating really quickly. Efficiency seems key sometimes.
In environments with high competition or risk of conflict during mating, yeah, quick, sneaky copulation can be an advantageous evolutionary strategy. Rapid ejaculation fits that pattern.
And comparing that to average human male ejaculation times. Roach brings up the debate about premature ejaculation. Is it really a dysfunction, or could it have been advantageous historically?
That's a really interesting perspective from Roy Levin mentioned in the book. It challenges our modern focus on duration as the only measure of function. Maybe historically, quicker ejaculation was adaptive. It prompts a rethink of what we define as normal or dysfunctional. Maybe the focus should be broader than just latency.
The book also touches on reduced libido from hormonal birth control, menopause, and the difficulties developing treatments like testosterone patches for women.
Yeah, hormonal shifts clearly impact libido. Finding safe, effective treatments for low desire in women, particularly post-menopause, has been challenging, with regulatory hurdles and mixed results for things like testosterone patches. It's an ongoing area.
And that failed study using synthesized monkey pheromones on American women. Seems like attracting a mate isn't as simple as bottling a scent.
Yes. That study's failure highlighted that primate sexual communication, including humans, is far more complex than just simple pheromonal triggers. Female choice and agency play a much bigger role than just passively responding to a smell.
Finally, Bonk looks at Masters and Johnson's later work on homosexuality, finding the basic physiological responses, arousal, orgasm, are the same, regardless of partner gender.
That was a very important finding. It provided scientific validation that physiologically sexual response works the same way, regardless of sexual orientation. Undermined ideas that homosexuality was somehow physiologically different or deficient.
They focused on functional efficiency in their comparisons, which sounds a bit clinical. But the finding that their volunteers had super high orgasm rates makes sense. Probably a self-selected group.
Very likely a selection bias, yes. People volunteering for intensive lab-based sex research are probably quite comfortable with their sexuality and likely highly orgasmic to begin with, not necessarily representative of the general population.
And one last surprising finding mentioned the prevalence of forced sexual encounters as a top fantasy across different orientations and genders. That's complex.
It is complex and definitely surprising to many. It highlights the intricate, sometimes paradoxical nature of human sexual fantasy, which doesn't necessarily equate to real-world desire or condoning such acts. Fantasy operates by different rules.
So, wow, after digging through all this based on Bonk, it's just crystal clear that studying sex scientifically has been, well, a really messy, fascinating, sometimes awkward journey.
Absolutely. Unconventional methods, surprising findings, ethical bumps in the road, but always this persistent effort to understand a fundamental yet incredibly private part of being human.
Bonk really does show the interplay biology, psychology, technology, culture, all shaping how we've tried to figure sex out.
Exactly. The methods evolve, the understanding deepens, but it's an ongoing quest. We certainly don't have all the answers.
It really makes you question some of the assumptions we might still carry around about sex, doesn't it? How much is based on actual science versus, tradition or media or just guesswork?
That's a great takeaway. Looking at this history maybe encourages a bit more critical thinking about our own beliefs and societal narratives around sex, intimacy, and pleasure.
Maybe fosters a more nuanced view of the whole landscape of human sexuality and relationships.
Hopefully. Understanding the journey of how we've tried to learn can be as insightful as the findings themselves.
Well, this has been quite the exploration. Thank you for navigating all that with me.
My pleasure. It's fascinating material.
And to you, our listener, thanks for sharing the source and for joining us on this rather intimate deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.